Going to be comparing the Oliver franchise to the DCEU. Reason for that is in part one of this series, I compared Oliver to Treasure Planet. Oliver 1, I compared Star Wars to the DCEU ones. Now I'm going to compare these two franchises. We look at highest score for each franchise. In the case of the DCEU, the first Wonder Woman movie has a 93%. In the case of Oliver, the 1948 movie Oliver Twist, based on the musical, has a 100%. When you look at lowest score for each franchise, in the case of Oliver, the Disney animated movie Oliver and Company only has a 53%. In the case of the DCEU, 2016 Suicide Squad, one of the biggest examples of studio interference, only has a 26%. When you look at average score for each franchise at the DCEU, you have an average of 60. With Oliver, you have an average of 81. When you look at gap between lowest and highest score, in the case of DCEU, it's pretty big, honestly. We're talking about a gap of 67%, whereas with Oliver, you're talking about gap of 47%. Oliver has won every round so far, so will be winning no matter what. But when it comes to which franchise I'm going to choose, well, this one's not hard at all. I'm easily, without hesitation, going to pick the DCEU because I'm much more familiar with the DCEU than I am with Oliver. I mean, don't get me wrong, I've seen Oliver and Company. I've seen part of the movie Oliver Twist, but that's it. Not only have I seen almost every DCEU film, the only ones I have not watched are 2016 Suicide Squad, the theatrical cut of Justice League, also known as Justice League, as well as Wonder Woman 1984. I've seen several of the DCEU films in theaters, so as you can tell, I have much more of an emotional connection to the DCEU, especially because Batman's one of my favorite comic book characters, and while he didn't end up getting his own standalone film in the DCEU, Batman is in Batman v Superman as well as Justice League. Technically as a little cameo in Suicide Squad 2016, but he's only on screen for just a few minutes. Now, when it comes to the DCEU, pretty much everyone is in agreement that there are good to great movies within it. The problem is that it was horribly run by Warner Brothers. They did not know what they were doing. They clearly didn't have a plan from the beginning. They didn't have a vision or a roadmap for a shared universe, and they kicked off the DCEU with a movie like Man of Steel that doesn't actually do much at all to lay the groundwork for a shared universe. You think about Iron Man 2008, and they are clearly setting up a bigger universe in a way that absolutely makes sense. It doesn't feel forced at all, but you can see the elements in there that are setting up a bigger universe. But when you look at Man of Steel, there's only a few subtle Easter eggs hinting at, LexCorp, Batman, but that's not much to go on. And on top of that, the starting pitch for Man of Steel was the idea that Superman showing up would be the most important event in the history of the world, which is predicated on the assumption that there has not been superheroes up to this point in time. There hasn't been gods around for a long period of time. No, Superman is the first of something like this to ever happen. When you get to later DCEU films, they absolutely contradict the starting pitch for Man of Steel. And on top of that, you look at Batman v Superman Dawn of Justice, and it's so blatantly obvious that Warner Brothers was trying to copy Marvel, but the problem is they didn't stop to think about the fact that, wait a minute, Marvel waited years to do the Avengers. They gave most of the 6 Avengers their own standalone film, and then they put out the big team-up movie. Warner Brothers made the huge mistake of trying to rush toward Justice League. So they tried to do a huge amount of universe building in one movie, and it just didn't work. I know there are people out there that, of course, enjoy Batman v Superman, but even those people would agree that you can tell with Batman v Superman, Warner Brothers was trying to copy what Marvel did so well without actually putting the work in. On top of that, when you think about the early period of the DCEU, it felt like we were building up to something, that being Justice League. And because Zack Snyder was involved in a lot of those early projects, Man of Steel, Batman v Superman, Justice League, things felt more, anyway, cohesive. But once you get past Justice League, Warner Brothers saw that things didn't work out. So unfortunately, they overcorrected. And thus, as a result of that, you got a bunch of standalone films that barely connect with each other at all. There's just a few subtle little Easter eggs here and there hinting at these movies are all taking place in one universe. I mean, technically, Superman shows up in the first Shazam, but you don't even see his face. So we're thinking as the audience, well, why are these movies even connected to each other at all? Why are they part of a shared universe at all when they feel so separate from each other? They're so different when it comes to tone. I mean, just compare The Suicide Squad from James Gunn to Aquaman. There's a big difference in tone between those movies because Aquaman is a lot more lighthearted. You can tell that the filmmakers know we're making a movie about a hero named Aquaman and they're having fun with it. But when you look at The Suicide Squad, it has James Gunn's dark sense of humor, so it's much more of an adult film that inherently isn't going to be for everybody. It's going to be too extreme for some people. So Warner Brothers unfortunately made the big mistake of just overreacting to everything, being incredibly reactionary. That really hurt the DCEU. I mean, you look at Batman v Superman, and it's so blatantly obvious that this is Warner Brothers reacting to the negative criticism that Man of Steel received. And then you look at Suicide Squad 2016, that movie is one of the biggest examples in the last 10 years of a production disaster. And that's because Warner Brothers was micromanaging things. You can so clearly tell watching the movie that it was heavily reworked in the editing room. This is not the movie that writer-director David Ayer wrote. It's not the movie the actors signed on for. And in fact, David Ayer has been very vocal about the fact that the version of Suicide Squad that was released in theaters isn't what he intended to be put in theaters. So when you watch the movie, you can feel the reshoots. You can feel that this was originally supposed to be a darker movie from start to finish, but then the studio heads were like, oh, Deadpool was a success, so we gotta make it more like Deadpool. And thus, they commissioned reshoots to add in bright colors, text on the screen, to superficially make the movie seem more lighthearted. You can look this up. It's absolutely documented. They brought in people from a trailer company to rework, re-edit, reshoot the movie to make it more like Deadpool. That's not at all a good way to make a movie. Whereas when you watch The Suicide Squad, you can tell it's coming from a director with a vision. He was allowed to make the movie that he wanted to make. And then you look at what happened with Justice League, and it's like, oh, yikes, this is not at all a good way to run things. The studio legitimately took advantage of a real tragedy in Zack Snyder's personal life in order to take the movie away from him and turn it into something completely different. When you watch Justice League, you feel like you're watching the Cliff Notes version of Justice League that has the bullet points in it, like on a list, but not everything's not allowed to breathe. Everything isn't allowed to develop, to play out properly. It's just a checklist, a series of bullet points without any of the development to make it actually work well. Now, I got to see Shazam, not Shazam 2 actually, but Black Adam, Blue Beetle, Aquaman 2, and Aquaman, and actually The Suicide Squad in theaters. I think Shazam 2 is an example of movie that's not one of the worst comic book films ever made. It's not a Batman and Robin, but at the end of the day, it just feels so generic, and thus, yeah, it's competent, but it also falls flat. I really enjoy The Flash. I think it's very unfortunate there was just so many things that were working against The Flash. So with this debate, Oliver's going to be winning, but I would personally choose the DCEU because as much as it wasn't run well at all by Warner Brothers, who didn't know what they were doing, at the end of the day, I am invested in comic book films. I like some of these DC characters, so I'd easily pick DCEU. But that'll wrap things up for this video.